Hi everybody, and welcome to episode 29 of Life Lessons and Combat Sports. I'm your host, Eric Hamidi. Thank you for joining me for another edition of April Mania, an entire month full of wrestling-themed episodes, so we're just trucking along here. And there was a little bit of a story as far as me coming up with the episode for today, or just coming up with the subject matter for today's episode, because the first thing that I wanted to talk about, to be perfectly honest, I needed to do a little bit more research on it, so I decided to not go with that particular idea. And then the second subject matter that I wanted to go with, I couldn't think of a good enough example from my own personal experience to try to illustrate the life lesson that I talk about. So I'm really, I don't want to half-ass anything. So because I couldn't think of a good enough example for that particular subject matter, I decided to hold off on that. So that got rid of the second option. And then the thing that I decided that I was going to talk about today is what I ultimately landed on, because I already had all the information that I needed for it. So we're just going to go along with that particular idea. And it's kind of interesting because it is, I guess you could say that today's episode is ECW adjacent, because it's not directly about anything that happened with the company per se, but it does involve somebody who was a part of that organization. So I guess I'm sort of fulfilling that master, or just accomplishing that goal, if you will, of making my episodes ECW themed, because I did talk about killing two birds with one stone with this particular episode, making April Mania about ECW related episodes, given that it is in fact the 25-year anniversary of ECW's bankruptcy. This month is the 25-year anniversary of when ECW filed for bankruptcy, that is. So what I decided to talk about with today's episode is, in fact, Mike Alfonso, better known as Mike Awesome. He was a former ECW World Heavyweight Champion, and he was a former professional wrestler. Something that happened in his career is basically what I'll be talking about here, but per usual, before I get into that particular incident, I figure it would be best for me to give you a little bit of an idea of Mike Awesome, of who he was and his career, just in case anyone who's watching it is not familiar with it. Mike was a former professional wrestler. He made his debut in the late 1980s, and something that I discovered about Mike Awesome's career, actually, this is something that I wasn't aware of, because even though I am familiar with some of the stuff about him, there were a couple things, I needed a little bit of a refresher on his career, so I went ahead and did that. So it was kind of a situation where I was just refreshing my memory about some things, or I was learning some new information about him. And one of the things that I learned about him that I didn't know was that he actually had some matches in World Championship Wrestling, WCW, in the early 90s as he was getting his start. So he has his humble beginnings, and he's just working the independent promotions throughout the United States. But the thing that really turned his career around, or kind of what he became famous for up until the late 90s, was when he started doing tours in Japan for this organization called Frontier Martial Arts Wrestling, FMW, between 1990 and 1998, 1999, something like that. There is where he really made a name for himself in his wrestling career. He was known as the Gladiator, and over there he had a lot of noteworthy matches and had a lot of noteworthy moments and all this stuff. One person in particular that he had a lot of matches with was this other Japanese professional wrestler named Masato Tanaka. They had a feud over the world title over there in that organization, and they just had a lot of barn burner matches, just these action-packed, violent matches that, like, just people really enjoyed those. So that was something that, as a little bit of a teaser, that started in Japan, but that feud would carry over into the United States once Mike Awesome made more of a career there. But at least from the early to mid 90s, the majority of Mike Awesome's time was spent in Japan, and in between that time, he would also make occasional appearances for what was known as Eastern Championship Wrestling at the time, ECW. He had his first match there in late 1993, early 1994. He would, he would make more of a name for himself or make more appearances for ECW as the years went on, but at this time he was just making a one-time appearance or just having a match here or there. It would just be that the majority of his time was spent in Japan. And this is another little bit of a fun fact that I learned about Mike Awesome when doing my research about him, is that in addition to his couple matches that he had in WCW in the early 90s, I learned that he actually had a couple of matches for WWF in 1996. I mean, they weren't anything noteworthy or what have you, but he did have an appearance there before, as a little bit of a, foreshadowing what's to come. He had an appearance there for WWF prior to 2001 when he does eventually get there. As the 90s go on, he's making more and more appearances for ECW. I know he wrestled some matches for them come 1997, and then the thing that he became really known for, at least as far as the late 90s US scene goes, was that ECW, they had a pay-per-view in August of 1998 where he wrestled with Masato Tanaka. They just, like I said, they carried over their feud into this match. And the thing about Heatwave 1998 is that it's considered one of ECW's best pay-per-views. So this was just, just overall, the pay-per-view was very well received. Everybody liked a lot of the matches on there. And then Mike Awesome's match in particular with Masato Tanaka on that card was, like I said just a few moments ago, it was action-packed, it was exciting, it was a barn burner and all this other stuff. So people really enjoyed that. And it was around this time that Mike would start making more and more appearances for ECW as his time in Japan started coming to a little bit of a close. I mean, like later on, I feel like I'm doing a lot of jumping ahead here. I mean, like once the 21st century rolled around, he would do more shows or do more matches in Japan, but this is kind of like when the shift was happening from him being entirely focused in working in Japan and transitioning over into the United States. So he has a match there with Masato Tanaka. Masato wins that. And then the year after is when Mike Awesome starts basically working a full-time role in ECW, which at this point had become known as Extreme Championship Wrestling. So the thing that kickstarted his full-time run in ECW was he made an appearance in the September 1999 pay-per-view Anarchy Rules, where he inserted himself into the world title match that was happening between defending champion Taz and Masato Tanaka, and he ended up winning their ECW world title. So that would be the first of two ECW world title reigns that Mike Awesome would have for the organization. And basically from the fall of 1999 going into 2000, he and Masato Tanaka just continued their feud, this time for the ECW world title. They would have a few matches with each other throughout that time. One of those in particular that kind of stand out to me is the world title match that they had at November to Remember 1999. Now, I've always kind of had a little bit of a fascination or just an emotional attachment to that match, because back in the day when I was a kid, there was this wrestling magazine that basically highlighted or recapped the entire year 1999, and one of the pay-per-views that was covered in that magazine was in fact November to Remember 1999. So I feel like I've always had an attachment to that event, because as a kid, not watching ECW or having access to them, I just found it fascinating looking at the pictures from that event or other events that ECW would have, and just felt like I was exploring a world that I hadn't really been exposed to. I just love seeing the imagery of like where these matches or where these shows were happening, and just kind of like, honestly, it's sort of weird, but like I even enjoyed the colors of the pages that covered these events. So it was just, I think that's why I've always been fascinated, or why I always liked that match. And it is in fact a match that I go back to and I'll watch here and there. Just every now and then I'll go back and I'll watch it, and I'm really entertained by it. Honestly, that may be my favorite one-on-one match between those two in ECW. So that was something that was noteworthy about Mike Awesome's time during that fall 1999 to spring 2000 timeframe. He would become the ECW World Champion twice. He would also become the ECW Tag Team Champion. And then finally, what happened in April of 2000 is that he makes the jump from ECW to WCW. And there's a lot of details there's a lot of things that go along with him jumping ship, and I'll get into the specifics of that in a little bit once I get to my life lesson. But for now, all you need to know is that in April 2000, he goes from ECW to WCW. He has a good start when he debuts, but then it all very quickly goes downhill, because after a few months debuting in WCW, they give him the gimmick of, Jesus, he becomes the fat chick Thriller, which basically his whole shtick right there is that he was into the, heavier set women and all that stuff. And I kind of talked about this in my WCW episode, just talking about how in the year 2000, to me, that was just a really chaotic time for the organization. And to be perfectly honest, I feel like this is just a manifestation of it, or just like this is one of the things that fuels that theory of just how chaotic and just how much of a mess WCW in the year 2000 was. And I guess I'm saying this also because something I haven't mentioned up until now is the fact that Mike Awesome, basically the way his character was portrayed was that he was this juggernaut, this brute force, this powerful guy who can't be stopped, and just honestly, he was a very well-rounded individual, because not only was he this brute force, but he was also very agile too, because he had the look of a big guy, but he would also do things where he would do a suicide dive from the ring to the outside, or he would actually jump onto the top rope and jump onto his opponents and all that stuff. So it's kind of like what I mentioned in my Kane episode a long time ago, saying that, the thing about Kane was that he was a big guy, but he was agile. So with Mike Awesome, it was kind of similar in that regard, but even more so than Kane, because Kane would never do stuff like that. Like literally, Mike would be in the ring, he would jump on the top rope, and then jump onto his opponent on the outside on the floor. I mean, that's just, and that was the whole thing about Mike Awesome, was that he was a heavyweight, but he moved like a cruiserweight. So to a lot of people who followed Mike Awesome during his career, seeing that as his character was just really disappointing, and it made no sense whatsoever. But to be honest, with the creative mess that was WCW in the year 2000, and then just having the kind of booking that you had with Vince Russo, or just having that chaotic management, whether it was bringing Eric Bischoff in and then he's out and all that stuff, I mean, like, just the overall product suffered. And this was one of the many problems that WCW faced, but on a more micro level, this was the problem that Mike Awesome had. And long story short, he's presented in a good manner in the beginning and has these matches that sort of play to his strengths, but then he becomes the fat chick Thriller. And then a few months later, he becomes that 70s guy. And I mean, that's just basically like a guy who's infatuated with 70s clothing and just the 70s style of talking, and just his whole presentation was based on that. And once again, that's one of those things where you think okay, you have somebody like Mike Awesome, but that's what you're doing with him? It's like, what the hell are you people doing? Like, why? I don't know. That's just largely disappointing, and that's probably something that I'm going to get into when we transition into the next part of his wrestling career. It's just, they couldn't, like, I just view all that as like both WCW and WWF later on, they just didn't use Mike Awesome to the best of their ability, or they didn't utilize him to his full potential, or just whatever you want to call it. It was just a fumble right there. That character of that 70s guy, he has that for like towards the end of 2000, and then after a couple months they drop in, and he's presented in a more normal way. He becomes aligned with this one Canadian wrestler named Lance Storm, another ECW alumni who jumped ship, and he was basically a teammate of Team Canada, and he's from Florida, so I don't really know. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, but it was definitely better than the first two gimmicks that he had. So he's with WCW from April 2000 until March of 2001, when the WWF bought WCW. And Mike Awesome was one of those individuals whose contracts were acquired by WWF when the purchase happened. So he was one of the WCW wrestlers that came over in the buyout. WWF, they bought WCW in late March of 2001, and then a couple months later, that's when they started the Invasion storyline, which was basically just WCW invading WWF, and the war happening between the two, and what people were hoping would be the dream match between these two organizations feuding ended up being a disappointment, but that's a story for another day. To get back on track, something that Mike Awesome actually became noteworthy for was that he was the first WCW invader during that storyline, when that storyline began, to actually win a championship from the WWF. He did that in late May of 2001 when he defeated Rhino to win their hardcore championship. Rhino being another ECW alumni who was with the organization until early 2001 and then went over to WWF. But honestly, with Mike Awesome, that was basically the highlight of his WWF career. I mean, a couple months later, that's when they included ECW into the storyline, and he was part of that contingent. But really, that was the highlight of his WWF career, because afterwards they didn't do anything with him. So the Invasion storyline moves along, he's just a background player, and then that wraps up, and he's just kind of on the minor shows, the C shows or what have you, until he's eventually released in September of 2002. After Mike Awesome's time with WWF, basically he goes back to working in Japan for a few different organizations, such as All Japan Pro Wrestling Noah, and 01. But in addition to those tours in Japan that he would do, he would also make appearances in independent promotions in the United States. In particular, he made appearances for this one organization called Major League Wrestling, and then Early Day TNA. So between 2002 and early 2005, that's what Mike Awesome was doing. And then the last appearance he had on a big stage as far as professional wrestling in the United States goes was in June of 2005, when Mike Awesome made an appearance at WWE's ECW reunion pay-per-view, ECW One Night Stand 2005, where he had a match with Masato Tanaka in one of the best matches of the night. I mean, there are certain people that just, they had this great chemistry with each other when they had matches together. I mean, a couple pairings that come to mind for me are like RVD and Jerry Lynn, or Sabu, or Eddie Guerrero and Rey Mysterio. This is another one, Masato Tanaka and Mike Awesome. It's just, it was almost like anytime those two were together, they never had a bad match with each other, and this was no exception. This was, once again, an action-packed, weapon-filled, hard-hitting, exciting bout that just, I mean, nearly everybody enjoyed that match. And like I said, that was one of the best matches on that ECW One Night Stand pay-per-view. Now, I'm not sure exactly if that was Mike Awesome's last match ever. I mean, I know it was one of his last matches, but whether that was his last one ever, I don't exactly know. But if that, in fact, is the last match he ever had, I mean, shit, what a way to go out. I mean, go watch that match and you'll see what I'm talking about. So, as far as being on a mainstream, like being shown to a mainstream audience and all that stuff, that was the last time. And then in February of 2006, Mike Awesome retires from professional wrestling, and the reason he decides to retire is because he wants to spend more time with his family and also start doing more work in real estate. I mean, I'm not sure exactly if he had already been working in the real estate industry or if he was about to, get training for that and just like start transitioning to that, but that was just his focus, what he was going to do. Unfortunately for Mike, in February of 2007, that's when he committed suicide, unfortunately, at the age of 42. So, as far as Mike Awesome's life and career, that's the end of the story there. And it's really unfortunate that he had that happen, or just like, it's such a shame that happened, because I mean, when you kind of look at the details about the end of his life, or just like why he committed suicide, it just seemed like he was, I guess it's just kind of like he didn't get the help that he needed. Because in researching for this particular episode, he basically was going through some domestic problems. Like, he was having some problems with his wife at the time, and then you had basically, like, if I'm not mistaken, the way that he was found was that some of his friends came over to his place and they were gonna like go out and all that stuff, but then they found him, they found him dead and all that stuff. So it's I guess I've kind of seen this around in doing my research for this given episode, just the fact that if he got the help that he needed, or just given the emphasis that society has nowadays as far as mental health goes, then if Mike had been going through those problems now, then things would have ended differently for him. And a lot of this stuff kind of plays into some of the stuff that some of the stuff related to the life lesson for this particular episode. I don't know. As I've gotten older, I've really felt for the guy. And I suppose you can only really get an understanding of that going into the particular life lesson for this episode, which I guess I should do that before I give any other thoughts about this. But what my life lesson for this episode comes down to is we're going to go back to when Mike left ECW for WCW. And it's very simply, it comes down to this. The reason why he left was basically he wasn't getting paid. ECW was having a lot of financial troubles, and it had reached a boiling point by the year 2000. I mean, just keep in mind this about ECW as far as how bad their financial situation was. 2000 was the last full calendar year that ECW was in existence. So, kind of paints a little bit of a picture as far as the kinds of, like, how bad the situation was. And something that I kind of find interesting about that whole, here's what I find interesting doing my research for it. There were a couple videos that I watched talking about Mike Awesome's career and such, and they both made a similar point in the sense that because at the time when Mike left, he was the ECW World Heavyweight Champion. And they both made a similar point in that if your world champion for your organization is having complaints about being paid, then you know it's a problem. And to be honest, it's pretty hard for me to argue against that. I mean, that just seems like one situation you'd want to make sure that you have, like, you have it all tidy and all that stuff. But the debt was, getting higher and higher, just like it kept increasing. So a lot of people weren't getting paid. Mike Awesome was one of those guys. So through a series of events, he's able to contact some people in WCW in order to eventually make the jump to go work there. Which kind of created a little bit of an interesting situation, which before I get into that, I'll just say that, there was a lot of things going into Mike Awesome leaving the organization, because there was talks about, would he appear on WCW Monday Nitro with their world title, or just like, what were going to be the circumstances of all that stuff. And just, there was a lot of back and forth between lawyers and stuff like that. But eventually an arrangement was worked out to the point where they settled on a time or date that Mike Awesome was going to drop the ECW title, which created that interesting situation that I'm about to talk about, where basically you had Taz, who had left for WWF in the fall of 1999. He made an appearance in April of 2000 to have a match against Mike Awesome, which, it created a unique situation where you had this guy from WWF jumping over. So you had a WWF contracted wrestler going up against a WCW contracted wrestler for the ECW championship at an ECW show. I mean, it would be pretty hard to replicate a scenario like that. And honestly, even if you did, it wouldn't have the same kind of impact. So that's always been a well-known fun fact about that whole situation. But basically, Mike, he dropped the belt to Taz, and that was the last of his commitment to that organization. So after that, he moved on to WCW full-time, and then that's where the rest of the story played out that I've already gone into. So that leads into the life lesson for the episode. And to me, it comes down to this. It's not, here's the thing. I didn't want to make an episode being all like, well, you need to get paid for your work, because that's just obvious, I don't think I need to make a podcast episode about that. I'm going a little bit deeper in that, in the sense of you need to go where the money is. Because yes, it's obvious you need to get paid for your work, but even on like a bigger scale, you kind of need to think about it in this way. This is like the best way I can sort of articulate this. I have a friend of mine who several months ago, he was in the market for a new job, or just like he was kind of exploring possibly getting a new job. Basically, he was kind of looking around on different like websites and all that stuff and seeing, okay, if there's a position open and it's something that I'm qualified for, just that I could theoretically actually get that job, let me explore that option. So it was just kind of a situation where you kind of see what's available, and if there is something that you are a match for, then let me give it a shot. Now, as far as where he's currently working, there's nothing wrong with the company that he's working at. It's not like he has any grievances with the company that where his current job is at. It's just a matter of, okay, in addition to the things that I talked about, okay, hey, if there is a job opening, I can apply for it. But if there's an opportunity for me to earn more money, then I'm going to go ahead and do that. Now, I feel like it's important, noting this stuff, because if you're with a company or working a job where, you like where you're working, you enjoy the people you work with, you like the company's like products or mission or environment or whatever it may be, it may be difficult to kind of extract yourself from that situation and actually go get a new job. I can definitely see how, that emotional attachment or that connection, might make it kind of hard. And maybe ultimately you don't want to leave, but at the same time, if there's an opportunity for you to be more comfortable financially and be more financially secure, then why not go for that? And that was something that I talked with him about. This was the opinion that I shared with him. I just told him that, like, I know you really like the current company you're at, and I know it might make it kind of hard to leave, but if you can actually earn more money, and in your particular field, whatever it is that, whatever kind of line of work you may be doing, if you are able to earn the most amount of money possible, then you should go ahead and do that. I guess, to be honest, I feel passionate about this stuff because, given today's society, just how things are getting more and more expensive, it's almost as if that quality or that fact of life is even more important now than any other time, perhaps. That's something that I feel is very important to share with everybody. Now, with Mike Awesome, it was a little bit of a different situation, or just like an even more exacerbated situation, because he wasn't getting paid at all. So it's like, and this kind of leads into the whole idea of what I'm talking about as far as like feeling bad for Mike, because I remember at the time, he got so much shit for leaving ECW to go to WCW. There was just this constant criticism of, oh, you sold out and just you went for the money and just like, all this other stuff. And it's interesting because as a kid, I kind of had that same mentality. I kind of thought similarly in the sense of, oh, well, why couldn't Mike just, stick with it and just, oh, he did just go for the money, or just, you kind of hear stories about, like, for instance, Tommy Dreamer working long periods of, like, Tommy Dreamer, who's one of the most famous wrestlers of ECW and one of the guys who's most associated with the organization. You'll hear stories of him not being paid for months by the company, and he stuck with it. And I just think, oh, well, why couldn't he be like that or whatever? But as I've gotten older, my perspective on that has changed, because you do need to get paid for your work. Let's be real here. We all have expenses. We all have certain responsibilities. And it's like, you need to get paid for your work, because you can't go to like a credit card collector, or just, you can't go to the bank and be all like, hey, can I pay in, legacy, or can I pay with, my match highlights, or whatever it may be. It's like, you need money in order to pay the bills and feed your family and all that stuff. And if you're not getting that at a certain place, then you need to go somewhere that will. In Mike Awesome's case, it's just like one of those things where it's like, dude, he wasn't getting paid, so he had to do what he needed to do. And it's like, kind of extends a little bit like further in the sense of, people wanted to vilify Mike Awesome for what he did, but like, no, if you're not getting paid for your work, then what Mike did, he was in the right for that. And anyone else would have done a similar thing to him, or just anyone in a similar situation as him would have done the same thing. So I have become a lot more empathetic to, an individual like that, or a situation like that, because, you have to like be able to provide for yourself. And just when you think about it in the sense of anyone who does any line of work, whether you're a professional wrestler, or you work in entertainment, or you're a banker, or you're, an electrician, whatever line of work it is, you have to get paid for that. In some respect, there may be some part of you that like, okay, you do that, you're in that line of work because you enjoy it, you're passionate, and you love it. But it's like, at the same time, you're not just doing it for the passion. You're not just doing it out of the kindness of your heart. And to be perfectly honest, something I've kind of realized, or that I've kind of learned very recently, is like, if you just go for, oh, I'm for the, let's say you're an athlete or whatever. If you're just performing that line of work because you're passionate about it and you're doing it for legacy, then to be honest, that's kind of how people can take advantage of you or exploit you or underpay you or whatever it may be. So that becomes an important thing. And just like, at the end of the day, you want to be compensated for your work. I feel bad for Mike because kind of what I've already mentioned, when you look at the circumstances of his passing, it seems like it was really difficult for him, and it was just created for a very hard time for him. And just, if he was in a situation where he was having these marital problems, it creates for like sad circumstances. And just like, if that is in fact the case, then you would have liked, or just like, maybe this is just the human side of me, you would like for a guy to live a happier life, or to have had a happier life and not gone through like the difficult things that he did. Where if we go back to 2000 and just even like several years after that, it just seems as though Mike got a lot of flack for it, that only now in hindsight we're kind of like, oh, well, we side with Mike Awesome a little bit more. I guess like that's kind of the way I'm sort of viewing it. Like, you don't want these bad things to happen, or just like you wouldn't want to go through that stressful time like in the moment, or just, I don't know the details about this stuff, but if his departure from ECW to WCW was something that actually carried with him and that people criticized him for until his passing, it just sucks that that negative stigma stuck with him and he had to carry that and it burdened him. I don't know if that's actually what happened with Mike, but if that was the case, then it makes me all the more empathetic towards his situation, especially when you consider just like everything I've talked about. I don't want to like repeat it, but here's another like fascinating fact that you need to consider. Even the guys in ECW echoed a similar sentiment to what Mike did when he wasn't getting paid by Paul Heyman and ECW as a whole. There have been some interviews or like podcasts or documentaries that I've seen where they'll say something similar along the lines of, well, it's business. You have to go where the money is and get paid and all that stuff. And to be honest, this whole aspect of this type of advice, or just these kinds of statements that guys in ECW made, that could be an episode in and of itself, because they were advising to do the things that Mike did. There's a documentary that I saw where one of the guys, one person who was part of this tag team in ECW, he mentioned how if you're in a situation where back then you got a call from WWF and WCW to go work for them and earn a lot more money, you'd be foolish not to do that. So it's kind of interesting where the things that the ECW fans would criticize the wrestlers for, you have people within the company telling you to do that, or just like they're saying that's what they would do or what anyone else should do. So it's like the thing that you're vilifying them for is the exact thing that they say that you should or that they would do. Because a lot of times you would have this thing where like people would leave ECW because they got a call from WCW or WWF to go work for them, and the crowds at their last match would chant, "You sold out," and all that stuff. But it's like, dude, they're telling you that that's what they should do. So it's kind of like, if they're telling you that's the smart thing to do, then why hate them for it? I don't know. maybe it's just all like hindsight, maybe. I don't know. And I guess like when I think about this sort of larger scale, it almost seems as though money was a little bit of an issue like a couple times in Mike Awesome's career, because I remember he mentioned how he felt like he wasn't paid enough or got the money that was owed to him, or just that like basically whatever payment he got for his ECW one night stand match wasn't worth, or equivalent to the work that he put into that match. So I don't know. It's just kind of interesting how money became a little bit of an issue throughout Mike Awesome's career. Um, you just kind of like would have liked for things to be a little smoother, or just a little happier for him. I suppose in some ways, whether it's like the core life lesson for this episode, or just like the circumstances of his, suicide and all that stuff, it's all kind of like a cautionary tale for anyone who may be watching this, just like to learn from that experience and such. Um, I don't know. I just feel bad for, I just feel bad for the guy, just, given the kind of like unnecessary hate that he went through in his career, and just like for certain moments of his career where it's just like, dude, he was totally in the right for that. But I don't know. Hindsight is 2020, I guess. I guess the last thing that I'll say is that like to be honest, it wasn't until like the day before I'm recording this episode that I kind of like thought about, just sort of like similar struggles that Mike went through, that like people within my own life went through, and just, in some ways I'm empathetic towards the situations for like some of the struggles that like Mike went through and such, and just, you kind of just, I don't know, you kind of wish that things like played out a little better. And I guess I'm just saying this stuff because I wasn't expecting to kind of like have those kinds of feelings about this particular subject matter, or just like see the similarity, between his situation and like people in my own life and all that stuff, until, the day before, like the night before I'm recording this episode today. So it's just something that's kind of interesting. And I guess it just kind of like hits me a little harder than maybe if had I done this episode like, several months ago or a year ago, or, whatever it may be. It just, I don't know. I mean, that's the whole, I mean, but then again, I guess it's, it makes sense that I would kind of see the similarity, because like, I see a lot of similarities between things that happen in combat sports and then, things in my own life. And that's just basically the whole premise of all this. So I guess it's not all that unusual. It just kind of like hit me a little harder than maybe if I had done this episode at a different time. But I think I think it's just, I think it's all just a learning experience. Just hopefully you guys can take what I said in this episode and carry that out in your own everyday life, and just, make your own life better, and just, make the lives of, just help out people that you care about who are around you. I hope you guys can do that. But let me know what you think about everything I talked about in this episode in the comments section below. Let me know if you have any favorite Mike Awesome matches or memories as well. Be sure to like, share, subscribe to my videos, and be sure to follow me on my social media accounts. I'm on Instagram, Life and Combat Sports, and then I'm also on Twitter at L Combat Sports. I'll catch you guys on the next one for April Mania. See ya.